Engineer as a class has a very broad spectrum of playstyles, everything from your usual turtling to combat engineer to even being a proactive member of society. But as with anything that you do in this game, your choice of playstyle relies heavily on the choice of items that you have in your arsenal. Team Fortress 2's weapons are usually just that, weapons. They might change how the weapon works or reloads and in what scenarios that they thrive in, but they usually don't deviate too much from the base mechanics. A scattergun will still work as a scattergun does, spy knives work as a spy knife does, and shotguns usually work just as shotguns do, with one notable exception. Sure, utility items aren't unheard of in Team Fortress 2, but they're typically reserved for melees or new types of secondaries like snipers' backpacks or heavy's fist options. But I guess if any class was to have their primary weapon be a more utility-based tool, Engineer makes a lot more sense on that front. To top it all off, it's even a weapon that helps him perform his duties in a far more convenient way than the way he would without it. So, today we're going to be trying to find out the situations that that tool thrives in, the uses it has, and if it's even worth using at all. And if I can go the whole video without referencing an 80s Disney afternoon cartoon. The Rescue Ranger. So, with all of that out of the way, my name's Cody, and I'm here to ask you one simple question and hopefully get one simple answer. How bad could it be? In December 2012, during the Mecha update that introduced engineer bots to the game's MVM game mode, we received 3 new weapons: the Vaccinator, the Loose Cannon, and the Rescue Ranger. Interestingly enough, each of these new weapons introduced some kind of new mechanic to the game, with the Vaccinator's resistances and resistance ubers, the Loose Cannon and its double donk feature, and the Rescue Ranger with its healing and building moving at a distance. The Rescue Ranger as a weapon has kind of a turbulent history with its balancing. Originally, this weapon was a must pick. Its synergy with the old Wrangler, which did not have that nerf to incoming ammo refills and repairs, and its original ability to infinitely heal buildings without needing metal, made the Rescue Ranger virtually a permanent fixture in any engineer's arsenal. Sure, not every situation is ideal for the weapon, but it was a pretty standard bit of kit. Of course, that also unfortunately made the Rescue Ranger a prime target for the chopping block. Its original stats are pretty standard. You could heal 50 flat health with no metal needed. 130 metal would allow you to teleport buildings to you at the risk of marking yourself for death. You'd have a smaller clip size and carry less overall primary ammo. July 10th, 2013 would see a slight increase in bolt damage and a healing buff from 50 to 75 flat health per bolt. July 2nd, 2015 during Gunmetal brought us a decrease in the amount of metal needed to teleport buildings from 130 to 100, and a few days later on the 8th gave us a fix to be able to heal mini-sentries. December 17th, 2015 during Tough Break brought a healing decrease from 75 per bolt down to 60. And finally, the biggest kick in the pants that the Rescue Ranger ever got, on October 20th, 2017 during Jungle Inferno, the Rescue Ranger finally came into line and was made to heal buildings at a 4-to-1 health to metal ratio. Its stats today sit at: your alt-fire uses 100 metal to pick up buildings from long range. Repairs will heal a max 60 health per bolt at a 4-to-1 health to metal ratio. Minus 34% clip size. Minus 50% max primary ammo on wearer. And you mark yourself for death whenever you pick up a building to haul it. The Rescue Ranger at first blush has its obvious strengths in scenarios where you need to make an escape or rescue your sentry gun or other buildings from danger. On top of that, it affords engineers more opportunity to wander away from the gun because they're no longer bound by needing to stay nearby to repair a building. They've got no strings to hold them down, to make them fret, or make them frown after all. Of course, it is worth noting that as it fires a projectile, it may take some practice to become more used to the fall-off that the projectile has. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's move on into Up until now, I've made using the Rescue Ranger sound like a dream come true. It has nearly everything that an engineer could ask for: building rescue, building healing, and even a more efficient heal rate. But there are some caveats. As with any weapon, a lot of its uses come from the situation that you find yourself in. The Rescue Ranger at one time may have been useful in virtually every situation due to its ability to heal without needing metal, but its biggest weakness was in a combat NG scenario, so let's start there. Using the Gunslinger typically classifies you more as a combat engineer, a subclass that spends less time building sentries and focuses more on the support of their teammates with dispensers, teleporters, and mini-sentries. This playstyle doesn't typically support the Rescue Ranger for a number of reasons. This used to be the case due to the mini's inability to heal being negated by one of the upsides of the Rescue Ranger. Its entire purpose is to rescue buildings, and being able to move a sentry gun that can't be healed was objectively worse than just rebuilding it. For one, it took 130 metal to move, but only 100 to build an entirely new one. In the modern day, not too much has changed. You can heal mini-sentries now, a change that came with gunmetal, the same update that finally decreased the Rescue Ranger's metal move cost, but even still, this really doesn't improve the situation much. It is still just as cheap to build a new sentry as it is to move it, and healing a sentry gun can often chew through metal reserves much faster than letting it die and moving it. It's even a better move strategically speaking. A constantly moving mini-sentry can instill a sense of paranoia in the enemy team, so if rescuing a mini eats as much metal as making a new one, then even more on top of it to heal it, what's the point? The mini is made to be disposable, rebuildable. It builds fast, it only has 100 health, and it's small, so you can occasionally be cheeky and hide it in bushes or in other environmental details. In this combat engineer scenario, you'd be much better off with the Widowmaker, the Frontier Justice, hell, even the stock shotgun. The Rescue Ranger simply isn't worth the metal cost to use effectively on the mini-sentries. Of course, there is something to be said about the rescuing of other buildings too. Typically, you're playing combat engineer on maps like Offense Payload, or the Start of Control Point maps, which means your team is moving a lot. And that means making a nest is often a Herculean task, because by the time a proper nest is made, you're already needed elsewhere, or on the flip side, there's simply too much opposition to make building a nest possible at all. But assuming you're in the former situation and not the latter, you will have more than one building to move, so how does it fare in these situations? It depends. It's kind of a cop-out answer, but in order to move buildings, you have to be in line of sight. And often, placing buildings in your line of sight means that your enemies also have line of sight. Snipers, demos, soldiers, they love easy picks on teleporters and dispensers, and especially sentry guns. But if your team is good at fending off these often deceptively sneaky classes, then maybe this is one good scenario for the Rescue Ranger. If they're not, you're better off using another primary and being willing to either walk to the teleporter entrances and teleporter exits, or the dispensers to move them and simply blowing them the hell up and gluing them back together in hell. If you're asking me, I don't think it's worth investing the time with the Rescue Ranger to try this type of combat engineer playstyle. Getting the footage for this was hell, because I wasn't anywhere near as effective as I could be with the other primaries, and I could feel it. That being said, there is a good scenario for the Rescue Ranger.
At least you ain't worthless anymore.
Nesting engineers have a much better use case scenario for our very precious C_Telly_shotgun. You see, while combat engineers have no real use for a weapon like the Rescue Ranger, due to the fact that their sentries and other buildings are meant to be more disposable, and thus them being more willing to part with them as the momentum of the game continues onward and they assist their teams in pushing, Nest engineers are meant to do the opposite. They are meant to halt progress, and as such, their buildings are meant to be much more permanent. I hesitate to say stationary because stationary often means a destroyed turret. Moving your sentry gun from spot to spot can help keep enemies from finding and destroying it too easily. The same could be said for other buildings, I suppose, but you don't want your team to not know where the dispenser or the exit is going to lead, as an example. The Rescue Ranger does shine in this scenario. With its ability to move buildings instantaneously, you don't need to pick up and do a walk of anxiety knowing that at any point you could be headshot or backstabbed and have your hard work taken down with you. You can now safely walk to your destination and teleport the gun to you so long as it's within your line of sight, which in defense situations shouldn't be too terribly uncommon. This may actually be the play to make too, as one of the most unfortunate downsides to the Rescue Ranger is the stat that makes you take mini crits while carrying buildings. Unfortunately, something that isn't quite made too terribly clear is that this applies to all forms of carrying. Even if you walk up to it with a wrench and pick it up, this still applies the marked for death attribute to your character. This makes carrying across large sightlines a less viable option, but also necessitates that if a building needs to be moved, you need to have some sort of sightline to move it. Nests typically don't have too much issue with this. Defense points where nests usually operate and crop up typically have pretty good sightline to all entrances to that particular point for very good reason, and as such you'll rarely have to walk very far in order to see the building that you so want to move. Of course, the main issue that you'll have is that most times the best points for the movement of sentries will be your first or last points of any given payload map on red, or the center points for King of the Hill. If you're playing Capture the Flag, well, for one, why are you doing that to yourself? You do deserve better. Unless it's a kink, we don't yuck yums here. And for two, obviously the intel is mainly where you'll be building. The issue with King of the Hill and Capture the Flag is that the objective never changes its position in King of the Hill, and in Capture the Flag, when it does, there's almost no point in moving the whole nest because it's either just going to reset or be capped soon anyway. So you'll kinda have your hands full trying to prevent, the whole being dead thing. On top of that, the closer you are to those last points on payload, the less reason you'll have to build teleporters unless your team can manage the Sisyphusian task of making the cart roll an exorbitant amount backward, and in that case, the timer is more likely to run out than the cart is to move backward any substantial amount. But don't take me saying all of that as me implying the Rescue Ranger isn't good in this scenario. It is. In fact, I found that it's often the best option, as putting a dispenser farther away and using the Rescue Ranger's objectively more efficient metal consumption to keep the gun alive is a smart move, as you're less likely to die from something like splash damage from a soldier or a headshot from a sniper due to being within the sightline of the enemy. I'm trying to paint the picture here that there is a lot to handle in these scenarios, so finding the right time to move a gun is an important part of the engineer's workflow, and reloading can often be detrimental to that. You can't move and retrieve buildings all willy-nilly with that little marked for death attribute as a constant presence annoying the piss out of you. It adds one extra layer to consider. With that being said, let's talk about another playstyle for a mode that I usually don't talk too much about. So I normally don't talk about the PvE Horde mode for TF2. Don't get me wrong, I love it, but usually a weapon doesn't change the way you might play a class in the game mode in any major way. I get it a lot on the videos that such and such weapon is really good for man versus machine, and the issue is that with enough practice, any weapon or class can be good for man versus machine. These taco bot cocksuckers might insist that there is a correct way to play each class, and even some classes that shouldn't be played at all, but the truth is, Two Cities, the only MVM tour that they ever added, at this point is such a well-known tour that I've heard it can be done with even just 2 experienced people, though I've not been able to find any verification on that claim. The point is that I don't talk about man versus machine because there's just too many variables and upgrades to consider for it, and mix that with the obviousness that in a mode where you can often buy canteens or upgrades to make up for the things that your weapon of choice lacks, MVM is usually not on the list of topics to tackle, but here, I do legitimately believe this weapon is a must-pick for an engineer in man versus machine. It is a strong claim, and I'm sure that there are other primaries that can work just fine, especially given that there was a time that this weapon did not exist. But I think that you would be objectively playing at a disadvantage without it. The engineer in man vs. machine does far more work than he does in casual. He's responsible for stopping large groups of small enemies. the occasional big enemy luring sentry busters away, and within all of that lies the rub. Sentry busters specifically can be a point of contention. You can pick up the sentry and walk to the buster, then walk away, but my preferred method is to place it farther away, let the buster run to it, and then blue ball the blue ball. Or at least I would if I had any metal! For me, it's faster, less sentry downtime, and the metal upgrades and farther dispenser reach typically offset the metal requirements needed to use it effectively. Additionally, the Rescue Ranger allows you to rocket jump yourself to new spots with the Wrangler, another must-have for Man vs. Machine, and reach new spots faster if the sentry needs to be moved farther away. This can lead to great high moments that I haven't pulled off in years due to not quite shaking off the MVM rust, where you can sentry jump to catch up to an escaped bonk scout and tally the sentry to the front lines, taking advantage of the buff that sentries get where they will auto-build if they were built during the pre-wave. And on top of all of that, if your team loses a point on a map like Manhattan, it makes moving the buildings up much easier. Best of all, the Rescue Ranger really doesn't need upgrades to be useful. If anything, I guess firing speed, but I usually play without upgrading it at all just fine. This weapon allows you so much more mobility and freedom that you desperately need in Man vs. Machine to be able to buildings from farther away, like the dispenser that your damage classes will need to utilize, and are actually a direct threat to its life because of things like splash damage, or the teleporter that becomes the ire of robots, seemingly at random. You can't afford to leave the sentry for too long, but you can't afford to let the dispenser, which will be in a more direct line of fire, die either. Yes, it's that important a building in Man vs. Machine. It supplies a constant stream of ammo to other classes, and for heavy, that means index finger pain from not having to let go of M1 for the last 20 straight minutes. The Rescue Ranger transcends Engineer to a higher plane of Man vs. Machine. In casual, it's a neat occasional side grade to use in tense situations to heal a building while keeping yourself free from harm. But in Man vs. Machine, it's a must-have weapon that if you have never put in your MVM loadout, do yourself a favor and take the time to learn how to play a true support in this horde mode and play around the Rescue Ranger's abilities. The Engineer really has no use for the other shotguns. Their upsides like crits, fixed spread, lasers that drain Uber, I mean, was that even really an option? None of these provide nothing to you in this mode where you really shouldn't have to shoot a thing with your gun when the big automatic Goliath here can do all of that for you. And you should have the Wrangler equipped anyway to focus giants. With that being said, the Rescue Ranger, regardless of situation, is only as good as the weapons that you have to support it, so let's talk synergy. What, you thought I wouldn't talk about Nering in a Rescue Ranger video? If you answered yes to that rhetorical question like a 5-year-old watching Dora the Explorer, then sit on your fucking hands and stare at the wall, the adults are talking. I know the Ninjaneer is traditionally associated with the Eureka effect, but there is something to be said for the Rescue Ranger in that domain too. The Eureka effect is a good starting point. It lets you build discrete teleporter exits that only function for you and allows you to teleport to your exits or spawn anytime you want. However, there's only so much that the Eureka effect alone can do with this playstyle. While it's good for getting you behind enemy lines, if you're going to Engineer, why settle for the ground? Why not Sentry or Bullet Jump or Dispenser Boost to higher planes of existence and use the Rescue Ranger to move a Sentry to a place that usually no one on the surface of this used to be green and is now an offshade of gray ball that you and I call home would ever see coming? This rooftop, this weird spot, this whatever this is, they'll never see you coming. The important bit is that if your team isn't creating that distraction or entry point for you, it can be significantly harder to accomplish on your own. Of course, there is always the chance that your plans will be foiled before they even begin, but no strategy is foolproof. Admittedly, it's a temporary strategy. Once the enemy knows that you're building in unorthodox places, they're way more likely to focus you down and ensure that it doesn't happen again. And you're probably not the most useful doing this, but it's a nice thing to break up the monotony of typical Engineer gameplay. Actually, moving on to synergy now, the important thing to note is that not all melees and secondaries are on the same level of usefulness with the Rescue Rangers, so let's start with the classics. The pistol. Regardless of if you're playing Combat Engineer with the Rescue Ranger or not, it's an okay choice. It gives you a reliable hit scan damage output. Practicing aiming with the pistol is a valuable skill. There might be other options that you prefer, like the Wrangler, but particularly for Combat Engineer, I guess it can help pick off long-range targets at best, or at worst, annoy them. Solid choice, 7 out of 10. The Short Circuit. I can see that working in a Combat Engineer environment, there's no real reason to be deleting projectiles or explosives to protect a gun that's cheap and easy to replace. But for Nest Engineers, it's a solid choice. If sticky or rocket spam becomes an issue and you can prop yourself next to a dispenser, using your alt fire to launch the occasional projectile eater in the sentry's direction and launching a couple of repair bolts its way is an okay game plan. The only issue is that the amount of metal that you'll have to spend to use it. One ball costs 65 metal. Quite a steep cost, I think, but occasionally it can be worth it. Primary fire at near point-blank range will eat 5 metal to shoot one blip of static electricity, dealing a flat 10 damage, but it doesn't take much distance to become absolutely useless. 5 out of 10. Points docked for its relative uselessness at farther ranges and in Combat Engineer scenarios, on top of needing metal giving you a lot of things that you're going to need metal for. The Wrangler. This secondary used to be the go-to before its nerf in gunmetal due to its damage reduction properties. In Man vs. Machine, it's a go-to for me, especially because it's easy to pick up the sentry and place it back down to negate the shield cooldown if you have to, but in casual it can be used to pester long-range targets in a Combat Engineer scenario and give you a reliable way to damage unsuspecting enemies who think you're defenseless. For nests, it can be a pretty good way to target specifically the problem people, medics, snipers, disguised spies that your sentry won't aim for, that kind of thing. Especially useful when combined with its increased sentry firing speed. Additionally, it heals slower while the shield is up, but your Rescue Ranger also has that more efficient healing ratio, allowing you to have more chances to pepper it with bolts than you would wrench wax to sustain it while the shield wears off in its dangerous situation. 7 out of 10, not as useful as it used to be, but it's still a top shelf choice. Moving on to melees, first up we have the Jag. You can use the Jag to place level 1 and 2 sentries relatively fast in dangerous spots. Sometimes this can even be more effective, if not expensive, than your usual mini sentry. It can construct really fast as long as you're whacking the sentry, but that's at the downside of needing 3 hits to remove sappers. But if you're tricky and sneaky enough, you can get a sentry nest and teleporter up in a much more risky spot than usual before they even know what's happening. And with enough practice, the Rescue Ranger aids in that survivability, because if push comes to shove, you can remove whatever's most important to you at the time from line of fire. 7 out of 10, it's a good choice for split combat / nest engineers, but also just nesting in general. The Southern Hospitality. The Southern Hospitality provides an extra benefit in that it can help nest engineers to be more efficient in tracking spies. If you don't just fucking kill them first, holy shit. Usually, I'd say the trade-off of fire vulnerability isn't worth the risk, but being marked for death when carrying buildings, I feel like kind of negates this. Either way, you're pretty unlikely to die to bum-rushing pyros or stray flares, but given the Rescue Ranger handicaps your damage output, and it's pretty hard to lead a shot to an invisible target, the Southern Hospitality can help to make those invisible French not quite so invisible. 6 out of 10. The Eureka Effect. Ninjaneer. A mystery out of 10 for the sneakiness. The Rescue Ranger has many good options to be paired with, and my recommendations would be Wrangler and Jag on defense, with a pistol or short circuit replacing the Wrangler on offense. Using the Gunslinger with the Rescue Ranger simply isn't worth it. The Jag, more often than not, can build a stronger and sturdier level 1 faster if you whack it a few times than the Gunslinger can, and given that the Gunslinger's minis build with an initial starting health of nothing at all, it's just not worth the investment to use both the Rescue Ranger and Gunslinger in tandem with each other. You are much better off trying to be an overly aggressive stock sentry NG in the middle of the battlefield. But if you're bent on using the Gunslinger, do yourself a favor and just use the Widowmaker or the Frontier Justice or even the Panic Attack. The name of the game with the Rescue Ranger is tanking, it's repairing, it's rescuing. In the right circumstances, this weapon becomes nearly as or more useful than your trusty wrench. It's not a catch-all weapon, and it's worth noting that your wrench, while less efficient, has effectively infinite ammo, as it were, meaning that tanking with a dispenser by your side can sometimes be far easier than trying to tank with a gun that eventually has to reload. Remember, those few seconds can often mean that the gun goes down. But to kind of cap things off, I do have some tips that I would like to recommend. Don't just use the Rescue Ranger to tank damage, but use it to heal damage while you close the distance between you and your nest should it be caught without you nearby, and failing all else, blip it away if you're starting to use more metal than it's worth. You could also try turtling behind cover using a dispenser to recover metal, occasionally tanking damage with the Wrangler. This is particularly effective given the better healing ratio that is, for some reason, listed on the stat card as a negative. Again, those few seconds that you need to reload could very well be the death of the thing that you're attempting to keep alive. So I'd recommend that if the Wrangler has to come out, close the distance and use the wrench instead. With the dispenser nearby, you're more than likely going to be able to tank the push and stuff Ubers like a pro, because odds are you'll definitely be their first priority, and even if the gun goes down, the Uber will practically be over. Remember, one of your main roles is support, and part of support is distraction. But my favorite strategy behind this whole repairing and tanking thing is just to troll them. Remember that you don't need to have a bolt loaded in order to use the Rescue Ranger's teleport mechanic, so just tank as much damage as you can until you think that you can't possibly tank anymore, and then just take it from them with the Rescue Ranger to rub salt into the wounds that their entire attempt in Uber failed and that they should feel bad. Regarding fall off, it's also important to note that the repair aspect does not appear to have any kind of fall off to it, meaning that if you can aim and account for the slight projectile arc that the bolt has, then you should be able to tank from most anywhere. Of course, there's travel time to account for, and this no fall off rule does not apply to damage. Not that you should be sniping with it very often anyway. Moving on to a recap of safety when moving buildings, remember that when moving buildings you are now under constant threat of being marked for death, despite you picking it up with the Rescue Ranger or not. So take extra care to ensure that the coast is clear before you attempt to make a move of any building for any reason. This doesn't apply when you're prepping to build a building. I shouldn't have to explain proper loadouts again, but sometimes the best use of the Rescue Ranger is to just not use it at all. Again, Combat Engineer is a piss poor situation for this if you're using the Gunslinger. The Jag works a bit better if you're prepared to be a bastard, but on the other side, I'd recommend using Wrangler or Short Circuit. Game awareness is key, and of course, not every situation is always going to be wholesale good or bad, so just because you're on defense doesn't necessarily mean that the Rescue Ranger is going to be a good call. So make your judgment call on if this weapon is going to help you or debilitate you depending on the team and the situation that you have found yourself in. Listen, I like the Rescue Ranger. That should be fairly obvious by now. It has great usefulness, and this Miami Element one may perhaps be the most expensive and sentimental item I own in the entire game. I've been playing for a long time, and while you may not know it, Engineer holds a very close place in my heart as it reaffirmed the kind of things that I'm best at in most hero shooter games. My reaction and aim isn't all that great, so sometimes being able to just support my team is good enough for me. And this weapon alone enables me as a user to do so many things that feel necessary in a more modern TF2 setting. With so many weapon combos and strategies and more experienced players out there now, you basically need to have an ability to heal from a distance in many situations. That's probably one reason why it's one of the best selections on defense for longtime TF2 players. One of the reasons, not the biggest reason. The biggest is probably Uncle Dane. So if you haven't yet, give the Rescue Ranger a try in whatever scenarios you want and see what it's best at. Because sometimes, not all crimes need to go slipping through the cracks of your defense. Some kind of reference was inevitable, wasn't it? Take care all, and I'll see you next time. I was so close!